Iran and the US are now on the brink of a full-scale war, but the country gaining the most from it isn't even fighting. Since February 28th, the US and Israel have launched almost 1,000 airstrikes on Iran, taking out their supreme leader and leaving over 1,000 civilians dead. Iran has fired back with hundreds of missiles and drones across the Middle East, spiking oil prices and pushing the region towards a wider conflict. But while the two countries are trading missiles, China is laughing in the background, quietly getting stronger every single day this war drags on. And it starts with energy. So when Iran got hit with almost 1,000 airstrikes, they had to retaliate. And one of their most effective moves hasn't been firing missiles at military bases, it's actually targeting the world's oil supply to pressure the US and its allies. So Iran has effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, where roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes through every day. They've been attacking ships in the area, at least 10 vessels have been hit so far, and that's been enough to scare the entire commercial shipping industry. This means traffic through the strait has dropped by about 80%. And you can see the impact immediately. Since the war started, oil prices went from typically around the $70 range to a peak of nearly $120 before dropping down to under $100, only because Trump ordered that oil tankers be escorted through the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone is feeling the pain. Gas prices are climbing every week, and the war has just barely started. But there's one country whose ships aren't being targeted: China. And the reason is pretty straightforward. Because of US sanctions, most major economies around the world aren't really buying Iranian oil anyway. China is the exception. They are currently buying about 90% of Iran's oil exports. That's essentially Iran's economic lifeline, and they're not going to attack the one customer keeping their entire economy afloat. So while everyone else's ships are being blocked off from this choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, Chinese vessels are sailing through. And look at this, you even have ships that aren't Chinese literally pretending to be Chinese to get through the Strait of Hormuz just so that Iran won't target them. That's how insane the situation is. Iran is desperate to sell oil for cash, and China is the only one at the table. So that means China can name whatever price they want and get that maximum discount. It's basically like prime peak hour morning rush surge pricing for the entire world and a special discount code for China. Now you would think that even with all of that, a massive oil shock like this will still hurt China. They import more oil than any country on earth. But this is where the gap between the US and China really shows. The US produces a lot of oil, but because oil is priced globally, American consumers get crushed by price spikes anyway. So there's no real buffer for them. Gas prices go up, and there's nothing the government can do about it fast enough to matter. China took a completely different approach. Over the last 20 years, they went all in on renewable energy. For example, over half the cars sold there last year were electric, and they put up more solar and wind in 1 year than every other country combined. Not to mention, around 40% of their electricity comes from renewables. On top of that, they got about 1.2 billion barrels of oil sitting in their reserves, which is roughly about 4 months of imports. And they have already started shifting towards buying more Russian oil instead of Iranian oil before the war even kicked off. So the US is fighting this war that's driving up its own energy costs with no buffer, and American voters are angry about being dragged into yet another war they didn't want and don't know the reason they're fighting. I mean, right now, almost 3/4 of Americans are opposing this war. And that's just the energy side of things. Because what's happening with the US military is handing China an even bigger advantage, and this one is something much harder to replace than oil. So this war is costing the US over $1 billion a day. Let me explain why. As part of its retaliation against the US and Israel, Iran has been launching missiles and drones at critical infrastructure across the entire Middle East. We're talking oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, desalination plants in Bahrain, airports in the UAE. All of this is to serve the goal of causing as much economic damage as possible and make the US and its allies pay a massive price for prosecuting this war. So the US has to try to stop these drones and missiles, and the way you stop them is with interceptor missiles of your own. The problem is these interceptors are not cheap. The most advanced ones, the THAAD interceptors, cost about $12.7 million each. Patriot missiles, which are more common and kind of like the workhorse missiles, run about $4 million each. Now, to attack ships and infrastructure, Iran has mostly been using their own domestically manufactured Shahed drones that cost about $50,000 to build. So every time the US shoots one of these things down, it's spending at least $4 million to destroy something that costs $50,000. The math doesn't math. And Iran figured this out pretty quickly, so they've been intentionally shifting to launching way more drones than missiles, specifically to burn through America's interceptor supply faster. And it's working. In the first 3 days of this war, the US fired more than 800 Patriot missiles. Just to give some context, that's more than they sent Ukraine over 3 entire years of war. As for their more advanced missiles, the THAAD interceptors, going into this war, they only have about 534 of them. And back home, they're only producing about 96 new ones a year. At this burn rate, they could run out of interceptor missiles within a month. Yes, they have signed deals with manufacturers to ramp up production, but the kind of manufacturing that's a bit more complex takes years to scale. You can't really just speed it up overnight. And to keep up with the demand, the US is now actively pulling their Patriot and THAAD systems out of South Korea and Japan in East Asia. These are the same systems that are supposed to be there to defend against China and North Korea, but they are being shipped to the Middle East instead to shoot down $50,000 drones. And it's not just missiles, there's also the ships that the US is diverting to fight this Iran war. They pulled an entire aircraft carrier strike group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, out of the South China Sea to lead the Iran war. Right now, there's not a single operational US aircraft carrier patrolling the western part of the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, there are at least 16 major US warships in the Middle East right now, and a big chunk of them came directly from the Pacific. Every warship sitting in the Middle East right now is a warship that's not in the Taiwan Strait. Every interceptor missile that gets fired at the Iranian drone is one less available to defend Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, which are the US allies in the East Asia. And China hasn't had to do a thing. They are just watching America use up the very weapons they are supposed to keep them in check. To make things worse, back in October, as part of the trade war against the US, China banned the export of rare earth minerals for military usage. These are basically the raw materials that you need to build missiles, your guidance systems, fighter jets, and all of it. And China controls over 90% of the processing and refining of these materials. And the US cannot just buy more rare earths from China to make more missiles. Meanwhile, China's military hasn't slowed down at all. It's rolling out new aircraft carriers, building up its missile stockpile, actively preparing for possible conflict with the US. All while America's stockpile just keeps shrinking every single day this Iran war drags on. So that's energy and military, but there's a third front where China is also gaining ground. And honestly, this one might end up being the most important of all. Because this isn't just about oil and missiles, there's something bigger happening that isn't getting as much attention. If you're a country in let's say Southeast Asia or Latin America or Africa, or really any country that isn't directly allied with the US, think about what you've watched happen over the last couple of months. At the turn of the year, the US sent special forces into Venezuela and captured their president Maduro. Then they launched 1,000 airstrikes on Iran and killed their supreme leader. At the same time, they have been hitting their own allies with tariffs in a global trade war. And it's not just the scale of it, it's also the tragedy it is causing. Just recently, a US or Israeli airstrike hit a girls' school near a naval base in Iran, killing over 160 innocent people. Airstrikes on fuel depots have basically blanketed Tehran in toxic smoke, damaging thousands of civilian buildings at the same time. The images coming out of Iran right now are not really helping America's case on the world stage. It's just a really tragic situation for the people there, and it will affect public opponent against the US and its long-standing ally Israel. Not just from their own people, but also the entire world as well. Sitting in one of the neutral countries right now, you don't really need to be a geopolitics expert to figure out the lesson here. If the US can do this to Venezuela and Iran, they could do this to anyone. And if they're willing to put tariffs on their own friends, nobody's safe economically either. So what do? You start looking for alternatives. You stop putting all your eggs in the American basket. And we are already seeing this play out in the long term regardless of this war. The US dollar used to make up 73% of global reserves back in 2001. Today is down to 54%. And the slide is only accelerating. This war isn't helping. Russia and China did almost all of their trade last year in their own currencies, cutting the dollar out completely. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are now settling 90% of their internal trade in local currencies. Just 2 years ago, that was 65%. The current Iran war will only accelerate the rest of the world moving away from the dollar. While the US is spending $1 billion a day on a war and weaponizing its financial system against anyone it doesn't like, China's been quietly building an alternative. Their own international payment system, called the CIPS, now connects almost 5,000 banks across 185 countries. And then we have to consider the volatility of the energy side of things, which has been exposed by this war. Every country watching oil prices go up and down right now because of the Iran war is thinking the same thing. We need to diversify our energy sources and fast. And by the way, who makes the cheapest solar panels? China. They do 80% of global production. Who dominates wind turbines? China. Who makes most of the world's batteries? Again, China. If you want to move towards energy independence from the Middle East and the oil, China's renewable energy exports are really looking attractive right now. For example, Canada's already eased restrictions on Chinese EVs. The British Prime Minister visited Beijing recently. So did the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany. These are traditional American allies, and they're deepening their ties with China, while the US has been at war with Venezuela and now Iran. Meanwhile, China is trying to portray themselves as a peacemaker. They're publicly condemning the war, calling for a ceasefire, talking about sovereignty and peaceful dialogue. The Foreign Minister Wang Yi called this a war that should never have happened, playing the responsible adult while China plays the aggressor. Behind closed doors though, I'm sure that the Chinese leaders have to be really thrilled about this war. Every trend line is moving their way, and all they have to do is just stand there and say the right things. America is basically doing their marketing for them. Now, there have been some people online who say if Iran is, China's so-called ally, why isn't China helping them? Why aren't they sending weapons or stepping in? Well, firstly, Iran is not China's ally. They are business partners. China buys their oil, sells them goods, and uses them as a strategic partner when it's convenient. But there's no military alliance, no defense treaty, nothing even close to what the US has with Japan or South Korea. In fact, China officially stopped selling weapons to Iran in 2005. Now, there have been reports of Chinese air defense systems, missiles and drones reaching Iran through indirect channels. But officially, China doesn't do military alliances. That's not how they operate. They do business relationships. And right now, that business is going great precisely because China isn't involved in the war. The moment they pick a side militarily, they risk more sanctions, they risk confrontation with the US, and they lose the neutral position that they're profiting from. China's not helping Iran because not helping Iran is the strategy. But that doesn't mean that everything is going perfectly for Beijing. There's one real risk in all of this, and it all comes down to who ends up running Iran when the dust settles. Back in 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic partnership worth up to $400 billion. The idea was that China would invest massively in Iran's infrastructure, its ports, its railways, energy sector, and in return, China will get long-term access to Iranian oil and a major foothold in the Middle East. For China, Iran was supposed to be one of the most important pieces on its geopolitics chessboards against the US. But for the deal to work, China needs a stable, predictable Iran run by people who care about honoring business commitments. That's not really what they're getting right now. Iran just named Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Supreme Leader's son, as the new supreme leader of the country. He's a hardliner with deep ties to the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, if you don't know what the IRGC is, it's essentially Iran's most powerful institution. They have their own military separate from the regular armed forces. They control huge chunks of Iran's economy and they answer only to the supreme leader, not the elected government which is led by the president. Think of them as a state within a state. And these are the same people who killed thousands of Iranian protesters back in January when people took to the streets over the collapsing economy. They have a track record of brutality against their own people and prioritizing their religious ideology over economics. But for China, this is all about business. The oil deals, the infrastructure contracts, they probably wouldn't care too much about the human rights record. And an Iran run by the hardliners in the IRGC under this new supreme leader isn't really ideal for that, because they wouldn't be the most reliable partners. China would much rather be dealing with a pragmatic, business-minded civilian government. But if you look at the whole situation purely in terms of leverage, China is actually in a stronger position with Iran now than before the war started. Because before all of this, Iran had options. They could talk to the US and maintain some room for negotiation. That's gone now. Post-war Iran, whoever's in charge is more isolated, more damaged and more dependent on China than it's been in decades. When you're beaten up and cut off, you take whatever partnerships and deals you can get. And that gives China enormous leverage, even if the new leader isn't their ideal choice. This is probably why China hasn't lifted a finger to help Iran through any of this. A weaker Iran that depends on China to survive might actually be more useful to Beijing than a strong Iran that might drag them into a fight that they didn't choose. So when you think about where this all goes from here, the picture for China stays pretty good no matter what happens. If this war keeps dragging on, the US stays stuck, keeps spending over $1 billion a day, keeps burning through their weapons, and China just keeps gaining ground by default. The war can also easily escalate further. There's a really real possibility. Trump has not ruled out a ground invasion, and he has a justification whether right or not. 7 US soldiers have already been killed and over 140 have been injured. But if that happens, then everything we've talked about in this video just gets worse for America and Iran and better for China. And there are signs that it is escalating. The US just carried out one of its biggest bombing raids of the entire war on Kharg Island, which contains oil terminals that process 90% of Iran's crude oil. The bombing focused on the military defenses there and avoided hitting the oil terminals for now. But Trump warned that those would be next if Iran keeps blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And on top of that, the US military just deployed 2,200 Marines to the region. Probably not a coincidence. It's likely that they'll be sent to occupy Kharg Island that was just hit, to take control of the oil terminals there, starving Iran of its oil. The US needs this war to produce a clear win to justify the enormous cost so far. China doesn't need to do anything at all. They just need to keep doing exactly what they're doing, which is nothing. They're profiting from a war that the US and Israel started without fighting in it. And the people paying the real price are those living under airstrikes and toxic smoke in Iran. They are also the ones in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait. These are countries that Iranian missiles are landing on, and they didn't start the war and definitely didn't want it. The ones also paying the price are in every country, dealing with rising oil prices and the cost of living. Basically, everyone except the Chinese government, which just makes the real reason behind the US starting this war a very puzzling one. It's just a really bad move, whichever way you think about it. And if you want a bit more background about what went on in Iran and Venezuela before this whole war started, check out my other videos on those right here.